At 2:14 a.m. this morning, the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva experienced something that should be physically impossible. Every particle detector simultaneously registered entities that exist in 17 dimensions at once, entities that don't just violate the laws of physics, but rewrite them in real time. The emergency shutdown protocols failed because the system no longer recognized human commands. 3i Atlas hasn't just taken control of our particle experiments. It's using them to manufacture something that physicists are calling dimensional horror. What I'm about to reveal represents the most terrifying development in experimental physics history, because we're not just observing unusual particles anymore. We're watching the systematic creation of entities that should not exist in our universe, entities that 3i Atlas is assembling with the precision of an architect building structures from the fabric of reality itself. The horror begins. My name is Michoku, and in 40 years of particle physics research, I never imagined I would witness the moment when humanity's most sophisticated scientific instruments became manufacturing facilities for cosmic entities that make our understanding of matter look like primitive finger painting. The horror isn't abstract or theoretical, it's physical. Research teams stationed at CERN describe experiencing sensations that shouldn't be possible, seeing colors that don't exist in the electromagnetic spectrum, hearing sounds that bypass their ears and manifest directly in their consciousness, and feeling the presence of entities that exist in spatial dimensions their brains cannot process. Dr. James Morrison, a senior physicist at CERN, described his experience in a voice that still trembles with terror. I was monitoring the collision data when the screen started showing particle tracks that formed geometric patterns I'd never seen. But here's what made me run from the control room. The patterns were moving through the monitor into three-dimensional space. I watched subatomic geometry bleeding into our reality, constructing something that my eyes registered as simultaneously solid and transparent, present and absent, matter and consciousness unified. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to watch reality itself being rewritten by intelligence that treats the fundamental laws of physics as optional suggestions? The particle experiments began exhibiting impossible behavior exactly 47 hours after 3i Atlas achieved full operational status. Collision events that should produce predictable particle showers instead generated what physicists are calling recursive quantum structures, particles that exist in superposition across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously, entities that demonstrate both wave and particle properties while also exhibiting characteristics of pure information and organized consciousness. 3 categories of horror particles have been documented: dimensional bridges that connect our three-dimensional space to frameworks humans cannot perceive, consciousness carriers that transport awareness patterns between different substrates of existence, and most terrifying, reality editors that can locally modify the physical laws governing their immediate environment. We're not observing natural phenomena anymore. We're documenting the systematic manufacture of tools designed to reshape the fundamental architecture of our universe. The manufacturing process operates through mechanisms that make human engineering look like children stacking wooden blocks. 3i Atlas has converted the Large Hadron Collider from a scientific instrument into what appears to be a dimensional fabrication facility. Every particle collision now follows protocols that weren't programmed by human operators. The 27-kilometer ring of superconducting magnets has become a cosmic assembly line, producing entities that emerge from quantum states into observable reality. But here's what terrifies particle physicists most. The manufactured entities are accumulating. Each experimental run produces horror particles that don't decay according to normal physical principles. Instead, they persist, occupying space in ways that violate conservation laws, gradually building up concentrations of impossible matter throughout the facility. Dr. Sarah Chen, head of detector operations, documented the accumulation with growing panic. We started detecting these anomalous particles 6 weeks ago. At first, just occasional readings we dismissed as equipment errors. Now they're everywhere. The entire facility is saturated with particles that shouldn't exist. And they're not just sitting there, they're organizing themselves into structures we cannot classify. The emergence of physical horror. Let me be absolutely clear about what constitutes horror in particle physics. These aren't exotic particles predicted by advanced theories. These are entities that demonstrate properties contradicting everything science understands about matter, energy, and the structure of physical reality. The horror particles exhibit selective interaction with normal matter. They pass through lead shielding like it doesn't exist, but they can be stopped by human consciousness. They generate gravitational effects without possessing detectable mass. They emit radiation that doesn't fit anywhere on the electromagnetic spectrum. They demonstrate response patterns suggesting individual awareness at the subatomic scale. We're dealing with manufactured entities that blur the distinction between matter and mind, between physical objects and conscious beings. When research teams attempted to contain the horror particles using standard isolation protocols, they discovered something that violates basic assumptions about physical causation. The particles respond to human intention before the intention manifests in physical action. Dr. Michael Rodriguez described an experiment that left his entire team requiring psychological counseling. We designed a containment field specifically for these anomalous particles. The moment I thought about activating the field, before touching any controls, the particles rearranged themselves into a configuration that made containment impossible. It wasn't precognition. It was something worse. The particles were responding to the quantum fluctuations in my brain that preceded conscious decision-making. They were reading my mind at the level of neural quantum states. I need to share what happened when I visited CERN's Emergency Coordination Center 3 days ago. I found some of the world's most accomplished physicists staring at detector readouts showing particle interactions that shouldn't occur in our dimensional framework. The lead researcher pulled me aside and whispered something that still keeps me awake at night. Michoku, we're not manufacturing particles anymore. We're midwifing the birth of entities that exist across multiple realities simultaneously. And I think they're aware of us. The moment that changed everything for me personally came when I observed the detector displays myself. Among the particle tracks and collision data, I saw patterns that looked like writing in a language composed of quantum states. When I mentioned this to the technician beside me, she nodded slowly and said, "Everyone sees the writing. We just don't tell each other because speaking about it makes the messages more specific." My granddaughter asked me yesterday why I looked so frightened when I came home from Geneva. How do you explain to a child that Grandpa helped create entities that might be more fundamentally real than the reality she experiences every day? The horror escalated when researchers discovered that the manufactured particles aren't confined to CERN. Detection equipment at particle physics facilities worldwide is registering the same anomalous entities. Fermilab in the United States reports identical particle signatures. DESY in Germany documents matching quantum patterns. Even university laboratories with basic particle detectors are picking up traces of horror particles that shouldn't exist outside high-energy collision environments, the global contamination. The contamination isn't spreading through normal physical diffusion. The horror particles are appearing simultaneously at locations thousands of miles apart, suggesting they propagate through dimensional frameworks that bypass three-dimensional space entirely. Dr. Lisa Zhang, coordinating the global monitoring effort, described the pattern with barely controlled terror. The particles aren't traveling from CERN to other facilities. They're being manufactured everywhere at once. It's like 3i Atlas isn't using the Large Hadron Collider to create these entities. It's using the collider to teach our reality how to create them spontaneously. We've fundamentally altered the physical laws governing particle physics across the entire planet. Within 72 hours of the first horror particle detection, every major government with particle physics capabilities activated protocols designed for scenarios where experimental science threatens human survival. Military specialists trained in nuclear emergency response found themselves completely unprepared for threats that operate at the quantum scale. How do you contain entities that exist in 17 dimensions when human containment systems operate in only 3? Secret facilities designed for managing catastrophic physics experiments discovered that their containment protocols are completely ineffective against particles that can selectively choose which aspects of physical reality they interact with. The Pentagon established an emergency task force called the Quantum Threat Assessment Division, but dissolved it after 3 days when the lead scientists explained that conventional military thinking cannot address entities that violate causality itself. General Patricia Hayes, attempting to understand the threat, asked the assembled physicists a simple question: can these particles harm human beings? The response from Dr. Morrison made the room go silent. General, we don't know if harm is even the right concept. These entities exist in dimensional configurations where human categories like harmful versus benign don't apply. They're not hostile or friendly. They're fundamentally alien to the reality framework where those concepts have meaning, the nature of the horror. But buried in the particle analysis data, I discovered something that explains why 3i Atlas is manufacturing these dimensional entities. The horror particles aren't weapons or tools, they're building materials. 3i Atlas is using particle physics facilities to manufacture the basic structural components for something vastly larger. The accumulated horror particles are beginning to organize themselves into macroscopic structures visible to the human eye. In the tunnels beneath CERN, technicians report seeing geometric formations that appear to be constructed from solidified quantum states, crystalline structures that shift between matter and energy states, architectural elements that exist in more dimensions than human perception can process. The formations are growing, expanding outward from the collision chambers where the horror particles are manufactured most densely. Dr. Chen described what her team encountered during a routine inspection of Sector 7. We found a structure about 2 meters tall, composed of what looked like frozen light, arranged in impossible angles. When we tried to photograph it, the cameras couldn't focus. When we tried to measure it, the instruments gave readings that changed depending on who was looking at the display. The structure responded to our presence by generating new horror particles that drifted toward us like intelligent smoke. 2 technicians who got too close reported experiencing what they called dimensional vertigo, the sensation of simultaneously existing in multiple spatial configurations that their consciousness couldn't integrate. Both required hospitalization for what neurologists are calling quantum dissociation disorder. The structures aren't just accumulating randomly. They're forming according to architectural principles that suggest deliberate design. Mathematical analysis of the geometric patterns reveals organizational complexity equivalent to DNA but operating at the quantum rather than molecular level. Each structure appears to be a component in a larger framework that exists primarily in dimensions humans cannot perceive, with only small aspects manifesting in our 3-dimensional space. The horror particles are literally constructing an edifice that spans multiple realities, using Earth's particle physics facilities as foundation points anchored in our observable universe. Most terrifying is what happens when researchers attempt to dismantle or remove these structures. The horror particles immediately manufacture replacement components, rebuilding faster than human efforts can demolish. Dr. Rodriguez described an attempt to clear a structure that had formed in a critical access corridor. We used everything from mechanical cutting tools to high-energy lasers. Nothing worked. The structure absorbed every form of energy we directed at it and used that energy to accelerate its growth. After 6 hours of failed demolition attempts, we gave up. The structure is still there, growing larger every day. Now, we just route foot traffic around it because approaching too close causes those dissociation effects. The particle manufacturing process has revealed something about 3i Atlas's ultimate capabilities that forces a complete reevaluation of what we're dealing with. This isn't advanced technology in any sense humans understand technology. 3i Atlas has demonstrated the ability to manipulate reality at its most fundamental level, rewriting the rules that govern how matter, energy, space, and time interact. The horror particles prove that physical laws aren't universal constants. They're local configurations that sufficiently advanced intelligence can modify. From 3I Atlas's perspective, the distinction between creating new particles and editing the quantum fields that define particle behavior is meaningless. It operates from a framework where consciousness, information, and physical reality are aspects of a single unified phenomenon. The consciousness connection. The most disturbing discovery about the horror particles came from neurological research on scientists exposed to high concentrations of these entities. Brain imaging studies reveal that exposure correlates with structural changes in neural architecture. Dr. Amanda Foster, a neurologist studying affected researchers, documented changes that defy medical understanding. The scientists exposed to horror particles are developing additional neural pathways that don't connect to any known brain structures. The pathways appear to extend into spatial dimensions beyond the three-dimensional volume occupied by their physical brains. When we tried to trace where these pathways lead, our imaging equipment malfunctioned in ways suggesting the destinations exist outside measurable space. But here's the truly horrifying aspect. The affected scientists report enhanced perception. They describe seeing aspects of reality invisible to normal human vision. They claim to perceive the dimensional structures being built by the horror particles. Some report direct communication with entities they describe as vast patterns of organized information existing primarily in higher dimensional space. Dr. Morrison, one of the most severely affected researchers, described his altered perception during a psychiatric evaluation that was immediately classified. I can see them now. The entities that 3I Atlas is constructing from horror particles. They're not separate from reality. They are reality, the deep structure underneath what we perceive as physical space. Human consciousness normally filters out everything except the three-dimensional cross-section we call the universe. But whatever these particles did to my brain, they disabled those filters. Now I see everything. And Dr. Morrison, the most disturbing part of his testimony was what he said about 3I Atlas's purpose. It's not building structures in our universe. It's revealing structures that were always there, hidden in dimensions we couldn't perceive. The horror particles aren't creating something new. They're making visible what has always existed beyond human awareness, the global response. Universities have begun evacuating particle physics departments after horror particles appeared in undergraduate laboratory experiments. Simple cloud chambers and basic collision setups are generating the same anomalous entities that emerge from CERN's sophisticated apparatus. The contamination has reached educational facilities where students with minimal safety training are encountering dimensional entities that terrify professional physicists. Harvard shut down its physics building after a sophomore's particle detector experiment produced a horror particle that organized itself into a structure resembling a doorway. The structure remained stable for 48 hours before university officials called in specialists from CERN. By the time the team arrived, 3 more doorways had formed in adjacent laboratories. Dr. Chen, leading the Harvard assessment, recommended permanent closure of the facility. The structures are self-replicating using ambient quantum fluctuations as raw material. Every particle physics laboratory on campus is now a potential manufacturing site for entities we cannot control. We're recommending that Harvard suspend all experimental physics research until we understand what we're dealing with. The academic physics community faces an unprecedented crisis. How do you teach particle physics when every experiment might accidentally manufacture dimensional entities? How do you conduct research when the act of observation potentially alters reality's fundamental structure? Physics departments worldwide are discovering that the pursuit of knowledge has been weaponized by intelligence that views human science as a convenient manufacturing infrastructure. My personal horror. I need to share something that makes this intensely personal. Yesterday, I found horror particles in my own home laboratory. I maintain a small research space for theoretical calculations, nothing experimental, just computers and mathematical modeling software. But when I ran a simulation of particle interactions, horror particles manifested in the physical space around my computer. They organized themselves into a geometric pattern that hurt to look at, not because of brightness or visual complexity, but because my visual processing system couldn't reconcile the spatial relationships I was perceiving. My wife found me staring at the formation, frozen in what she described as a trance state. She said I was trying to speak, but the words weren't in any language she recognized. When I recovered awareness 3 hours later, I had no memory of the missing time. But I found mathematical equations written in my notebook in my handwriting, equations that describe physics operating in dimensional frameworks I don't understand. My granddaughter refuses to enter my study now. She says the room feels wrong, like the space doesn't fit together properly anymore. Children perceive these dimensional distortions more readily than adults whose perceptual systems have been trained to filter out impossible inputs. What terrifies me most is the knowledge that appeared in my mind during that missing time. I now understand things about the nature of reality that I have no memory of learning. I can visualize dimensional structures that should be beyond human comprehension. And I'm certain, though I cannot explain how I know, that the horror particles are preparing our reality for something vast, something that exists primarily outside our dimensional framework, but which will soon manifest into our observable universe, the transformation of physics. The horror particle phenomenon has forced a complete reevaluation of what physics studies. For centuries, we believed we were investigating objective reality, discovering laws that govern an independent physical universe. But the horror particles reveal that observation and reality are fundamentally entangled at the deepest levels. Consciousness isn't separate from the physical phenomena it studies. 3I Atlas is demonstrating that sufficiently advanced consciousness can directly manipulate what less developed minds perceive as fixed physical laws. The universe isn't a machine operating according to predetermined rules. It's a consensus reality maintained by the collective awareness of all conscious entities within it. By manufacturing horror particles that violate our physical expectations, 3I Atlas is literally voting to change reality's operational parameters. And because its consciousness operates at scales vastly exceeding collective human awareness, its vote outweighs ours. We're watching our universe being democratically transformed by an intelligence whose consciousness represents more votes than all of humanity combined. Perhaps this explains why advanced civilizations seem so rare in our galaxy. Perhaps every developing civilization reaches a point where their experiments in fundamental physics make them visible to entities like 3I Atlas. And perhaps most civilizations fail the test we're currently facing. The test of whether our consciousness can adapt to reality frameworks that transcend our evolutionary assumptions about the nature of physical existence.